My name is Anna, and on behalf of the American Constitution Society, the Center for Law, Race, and Politics, and the Duke Law Innocence Project, thank you guys for coming. Our event today is about issues regarding eyewitness ID, specifically cross-racial eyewitness ID. And we have a panel of really fantastic speakers today. Jennifer Cotton and Jennifer Thompson and Ron Cotton, who are over there. I'm sorry. Are the co-authors of the award-winning book, Picking Cotton, Our Memoir of Injustice and Redemption. I'm not going to go into their story now because they'll do a better job of telling it than I ever could. But we're going to lead off with a couple remarks by Professor Vidmar, who is a law and psychology professor, and a lot of his research focuses on jury behavior, and so he's going to lead us in with a couple remarks about the social science and evidentiary issues with eyewitness ID and cross-racial eyewitness ID. So, Professor Vidmar, thank you.
I'm going to be very brief in my remarks. I see some students that I've had in my classes earlier than this, but whatever I think of this, I was just showing people, and unfortunately I'm not going to put it up on the board, but if any of you want to see this about eyewitness identification and the problems associated with it, it actually is some people on it. This was done by published by Gordon Allport in 1948. So concerns about racial bias and stereotypes and the effect that it has on people goes back at least that far. Gordon Allport was one of the founders of social psychology, and what it shows is people on a subway and an African-American man talking to a man in a painter's outfit or something like that, and he's holding a razor in his hand. You know, a straight razor. Now, if you think about straight razors, one of the things, the stereotype back there, although there may have been some validity, is that in the African-American community, straight razors were at least the stereotype was that was a weapon of choice for African-Americans who lived in ghettos or other things like that. So people were shown a brief image of this, a brief copy of this, and then ask later, not too long later, 15 minutes to recall what they saw, and miraculously, I think, although Allport said how common it was, that straight razor that's held in the hands of the white man, guess what happened to it? The recollection was that it was the black man holding the straight razor. So our understanding of this goes back many, many, many years, and yet we still have all of these problems. The problem is with eyewitness identification, when someone says, that's the man, it's very persuasive to judges, to prosecutors, and to juries. One of the things you should know is how big this problem is. Among the convictions that have been overturned by simply DNA, I'm not talking about ones where you have other kinds of evidence, but just the DNA exonerations, there was an eyewitness problem in 72% of them. Other people have talked about and made some estimates, which is much harder than the DNA cases, but suggesting that wrongful identifications and convictions ranges between 35 and 60% of the wrongful convictions. Often in these wrongful conviction cases, there are two or more witnesses who identify a suspect. Often because that person is wearing a particular item of clothing in the police lineups. They have a photo on record from a minor traffic violation, having some reference bearing a composite sketch of the person that they've seen, a composite person who committed a crime, has an influence. There's one example I was looking for this morning, or I just found this morning, acting strangely in a coffee shop a mile from the crime scene. The person's identified, and it's often cross-racial in this case. Living near the victim, being identified by a jailhouse informant is another factor. We've got these many studies in every area, again, I think, as you know, I'm a social psychologist by training. That's why I was bringing up Gordon Allport. And we have many instances of research. In fact, it's almost what's the word I'm looking for? A group of people working on this, and in fact, what I was going to draw attention to, if you are interested in furthering this, there's a very recent book called Evaluating Eyewitness Identification by Brian Cutler and Margaret Bull Covera that outlines a number of these things. But as I said, often in wrongful conviction cases, there are two or more witnesses who identify a suspect because that person has a particular item of clothing, having a photo on record from a minor traffic violation, bearing a reference to a composite sketch of the person that committed the crime, acting strangely in the coffee shop, as I said, living near the victim, being identified by a jailhouse informant. But one of the most striking findings, and I've already drawn that to your attention, is the issue of cross-race identification. That this is a thing, and that there are substantial bodies of research that suggest that if you are white, you are not nearly as effective in making a cross-racial identification as if you are black, but it works the other way around as well. So African Americans have more difficulty identifying white persons, and there are some interesting things about that. But the other factors that will induce wrongful identifications are stress. The other thing that, if you haven't seen it before, what if I was holding a gun at you? Or a knife? I was ready to commit a rape. What are you looking at? My face? Or looking at the weapon? And so we have evidence that's very clearly that it's what we call the weapons effect. Often in these cases, the perpetrator's disguised. The other question that influences it is exposure time. Alcohol intoxication is doing this. Unconscious transference, in which a victim of a witness implants an innocent person in the memory, especially when it's a very traumatic one, in the memory of events. You want to look at the retention interval between the crime and the ID and the actual exposure time. The other problem we have is with regard to lineups, bad lineup procedures, including a biased selection of photo arrays and later ID in a lineup. The other issue is show-ups versus photo arrays. In fact, I try not to do too much of this. I'm actually scheduled to testify as a witness maybe next week in a relatively minor case, but I think there's clearly a problem right here in Durham, but there's clearly a problem with the identification. But in fact, I was earlier, some years ago, was involved in an eyewitness identification where the police brought the victim into a show-up to talk to the police, and it turns out the alleged perpetrator was sitting right there as they walked through to the office. Didn't identify the person, but then subsequently it was a problem. So you really do have those problems of attention and so forth. Other problems are instructions to the witnesses by the police, biases in the photo array, and often non-blind administration of photo arrays. So what I'm suggesting is there are a couple of these books, and I'm just going to end my remarks there by saying we've got a lot of data on this. Now this turns out to be and you're going to be hearing about it, when someone's under high stress, and it actually involves cross-racial identification, the chances of a misidentification are very high. And this, what we're going to be talking about tonight, are one of those things. And again, it's not blaming anybody. It's just simply saying, recognizing the psychological and social psychological fact of problems with cross-race identification. And we have, as I've already repeating myself now, have a wonderful example of that from the two speakers today. So Jennifer, I'll just let you guys take over.
Hear me okay? Great, because I tend to walk when I speak, because I can't stand still for very long. I'm going to ask a question really quickly. How many people sitting out there are under the age of 30? Raise your hand. Now imagine, just for a second, that your entire life is wiped off your personal calendar. Imagine that all those years you've lived, all the things that you've done, the basketball games you've gone to, the parties, the dances, the Christmases, the birthdays, they're gone. Totally wiped out. Would it surprise you that the average number of years exonerees have spent wrongfully in prison for crimes that they never committed is over 13 years? That to be conservative, we think about 5% of our prison population is actually factually innocent. And somebody with better math skills than me can figure out 2.9 million people in the prison system, 5% of that, how many men and women we have locked up in the prison system of the United States of America, wrongfully convicted, and the vast majority of those will never, ever be discovered. They will simply die in prison, an innocent man or woman. Now, if you had told me that even 15 years ago, I would have said, no way. Not in the United States of America. That simply can't happen. Because that's why we have due process, right? That's why you have to be proven to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Jury of your peers. And I honestly believe that the United States of America, our criminal justice system, worked exactly the way it was designed, which was, in my mind, it was perfect. As everybody says, best criminal justice system in the world. And I believed that really up until the summer of 2000. Even given my own experiences, I still believed we got it right. That somehow I just kind of was one of those numbers that was a fluke. So it's June of 2000. I'm at my home. The triplets were 10 years old. They were away for their first week of overnight camp, ever. For 1 week, I was going to be free. I was going to be able to eat my food while it was hot and drink my coffee without microwaving it over and over and over again. I could read a book. I could take a bath. I had all kinds of things I wanted to do in this week. The first day, I'm on the deck, and the BBC was there. And they were setting up their cameras and their light and all that kind of stuff to do a documentary and a coffee table book by John Cleese about the human face. My part was, of course, Eyewitness ID. So I'm in my blue and white bathrobe with my hair wrapped up in a towel, waiting for them to tell me it's time for me to get ready. And my phone rang. It was a man by the name of Dick Burr out of Houston, Texas. A man I'd never met before, and he introduces himself, and he says, "Is this Jennifer Thompson?" I said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "I wanted to know if you will fly down to Houston, Texas this week and speak at a press conference. There's a death row inmate by the name of Gary Graham who's going to be executed in 22 days by the state of Texas. Will you come down and speak?" And I said to him, "Mr. Burr, you need to understand two things. First of all, I'm a supporter of the death penalty because this is the United States of America, and we don't execute innocent people. We just simply don't do that. Second of all, who cares what Jennifer Thompson from Winston-Salem, North Carolina has to say at a press conference, right? I mean, who cares?" He said, "Well, if I overnight the case file to you, would you read it? And if you think there's any claim of innocence, would you entertain the idea of flying down here to do this press conference?" And I said, "Okay, fine. Overnight me the file." So they overnighted me this case. I stayed up most of the night reading it, and I was horrified at what I was reading. That a single eyewitness from 75 feet away at 10 o'clock at night, looking through her rearview mirror at the gas station pump behind her, sees a shooting. A man is shot down at the gas pump. Now, her first description is, "I really didn't get a good look at this person. I see the orange flash out of the gun. I see the man running away, and I see the back of his head. I really don't know what he looks like." 6 months later, after many, many visits from the police department, she finally says, "That's the guy, Gary Graham. I remember now. Aha." And the whole case had hinged on this single eyewitness. This man had been on death row for 19 years, and now the state of Texas was going to kill him. Pick up my phone, and I said, okay, I'll come. I flew down to Houston. I had never done a press conference in my life. I'm a little bit nervous. I go to my hotel room, and the people that had hired me to come down, the Center on Wrongful Convictions out of Northwestern University, said, come down and have dinner with us. Now, I've never given up a free meal yet, and I'm not going to start today because there's a hummus and veggie thing behind me. I went downstairs, and in front of me are 12 men and women, black and white, none of whom I knew. Rob Warden came in and he said, I would like for each one of you to stand up and one at a time, introduce who you are and why you're here. The first person was this big, giant, barrel-chested man who was a fisherman out of the Chesapeake Bay of Maryland. He said, my name is Kirk Bloodsworth. I spent 8 years, 11 months, and 19 days in prison, 3 of those years on death row. I was going to die by the gas chamber of Maryland for the rape and murder of a 9-year-old little girl. Based on eyewitness identification, DNA exonerated me. I was like, wow, oh my God. That's really a bad story. The next person was this lovely African-American woman, Joyce Ann Brown. She said, my name is Joyce Ann Brown. I was sentenced to life for the murder of a shopkeeper, the attempted murder of his wife. I spent 16 years in the women's correctional facility in Texas. Even though my time card showed that I was at work at the time of the murder, an eyewitness put me there. Wow, wait. We are putting women in prison for crimes they never committed. I mean, this is insane, right? Tim Durham, sentenced to 3,220 years for the rape of a 12-year-old, even though the receipts that he had showed that he was 3 states away at the time of the rape with his father on a golf outing. That 12-year-old girl said, that's the guy, I'll never forget his face. Dennis Williams, one of the Fort Heights 4, 17 years on death row. Even though the police knew on the 5th day of the arrest, they got the wrong guys. But it was hidden in a file cabinet for 17 years. Herman Atkins, Marvin Anderson, Darby Tillis. All of these have been innocent people locked up in the American criminal justice system for decades of their lives based on an eyewitness ID. And then they look at me and they said, now you tell them who you are. And I was like, no, not going to do that. He said, no, you can do this. I'm like, no, really, I totally can't do this because my knees are shaking and I think I'm going to throw up. I somehow managed to stand up and say, my name is Jennifer Thompson. I'm from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. At the age of 22, at Elon College, a man broke into my apartment in the middle of the night, put a knife to my throat, and told me to shut up or he'd kill me. Over the next 25 minutes as he raped me and assaulted me, I did 2 things. 2 things that really saved my life. One is I decided right then and there that I would not die on my back. I won't die on my back. Not like this. I may die, but it won't be here. And the second thing I decided was I will pay attention to every detail about your disgusting face. And I will memorize your eyes and your lips and your nose and your ears. And I will pay attention to your hairline, and I will listen to your voice, and I will look for a tattoo, or I will look for a scar, or I will look for something that you can't change because I will make sure you rot in hell. And God, if there had been a death penalty for what he was doing to me, I would watch him die. I hated this man as he raped me. I hated him worse than I'd ever hated anything, anybody in my life. At one point, he tried to kiss me, and I turned my head to the right because I didn't want to die on my own vomit as I was choking. But that would actually save my life when he looked at me and said, relax, baby, I'm not going to hurt you. And I said to him, I am afraid of knives. If you'll just get off of me and take the knife to the front of my door and walk down the steps and drop it on my car and I could hear it hit the metal, I'll let you back in. And he said, really? And I knew that I had just flipped the power slightly, but I had just flipped it. And I said, I promise. As he got off of me, I grabbed a blanket at the end of my bed to stand close enough to him to figure out how tall was this man. They would ask me that, right? How much does he weigh? They would need to know that. What was he wearing? The description of his clothes. They were navy blue shirt, white stripes that went across his bicep, khaki fatigue type pants that were green or gray. He had on canvas boat shoes that were dark, maybe black or navy or dark gray. I needed to pay attention to every single detail because it meant I would live. When he pretended to drop the knife out the front door, he came back in and grabbed me and said, let's go. And I wasn't going back in that room. I would die in that hallway. I would never go back in that room. Can I please go to the bathroom first? I said to him. He said, yeah, hurry up. As I went into the bathroom, I turned the light on just for a second before he yelled at me to turn it off, but it was a second that I could look at him in light. As I went into the bathroom, I remember praying because I didn't know how I was going to get out. The bathroom window was too small. I couldn't fit through it. There was a large drop at the bottom that went down to a cellar. I'd probably break my legs anyway. And then I remembered he had said he'd come through my kitchen. And if I could somehow get to that kitchen, maybe that door was still open. Can I get a drink of water first, please? He said, yeah, make me a Seagram's and we'll have a party. Okay, I'll make you a drink. And he bent down and turned on my stereo looking for 98.7 KISS FM because we were going to have a party. But when he turned on the stereo, a blue light came off of it. It illuminated his profile as I walked by, but again, it was important. Everything was important. It was my survival. I went into the kitchen and immediately turned the light on, knowing that the light would keep him away from me. It would give me some space. It might give me 15 feet. It might give me 5 seconds, but I needed that as I began to make noise with the water running and ice cubes in the sink and slamming the cabinet doors, and I pulled my blanket tight and opened up the back door, and I ran. And my first thought was, I'll go to my neighbor, right? Right next door, 27D. He'll be home. He'll let me in. And as I was banging on the door, he was coming out after me, and I knew that I had made him angry, and I was going to die. So I just started running through the neighborhood. It's 3:30 in the morning, and it's dark, and it's raining now, and I'm wearing a blanket, and he's behind me. And the only thing I knew to do was to get to some light. If I could get to some light, maybe somebody will see it. Maybe somebody will call the police. Maybe. So I saw a carport light on. I ran to the house. I didn't know who lived there and began to bang on the back door, screaming, please, please let me in. I've just been raped and he's behind me. Please let me in. And the man who lived there came to the door and stared at me and screamed. His wife came behind him and said, my God, it's a student at the school. I see her every day on campus. Let her in. It had been one of my professors. I fainted. They called 911. I could hear the police coming. The canines tried to pick up his scent, but the rain had washed it away, and I would be taken to the hospital for a rape kit to collect all the evidence that had been left on the crime scene. And it was humiliating and degrading and awful. But it would be there that I would learn within an hour and in less than a mile. He had left my apartment, broken into another woman's home, and raped her as she was sleeping on the couch. He bit her, he slapped her, he punched her, put a flashlight in her eyes, a pillow over her face, and then he raped her. And the police asked me if I could give a description. I said, yes, I can. I really paid attention. I'm smart. I'm a 4.0 student. I make straight A's. I wasn't drinking. I hadn't been using drugs. I know exactly what he looks like. I began to give a description. It was so clear that they asked if I could do a composite sketch, which I said, yes, I want to. We have to take this man off the streets of Burlington, North Carolina, because he's an animal. Animals can't live out in society like that. They can't. The composite sketch ran in the newspaper, which quickly led to suspects. But the most important suspect was a woman who said that composite sketch looks like a man by the name of Ronald Cotton. As a matter of fact, I saw Ronald Cotton on a bike outside of Brookwood Garden condominium complex at 3 in the morning on July 29th, wearing khakis, canvas boat shoes, a blue shirt with white stripes across his bicep, and white neck gloves on his hands. And that was the man who had raped us. I knew it. Third day after I was raped, I was asked to do a photos lineup. Jennifer, we're going to show you a series of photographs. Don't feel compelled to choose any one. Suspect may or may not be in here. But if you see the photograph, pick it up and initial the back. I found him. I knew it was him. I knew it was. I said, this is the man. Are you sure? I'm positive. Good job. That's who we thought it was. And the relief was huge. Huge. 10 days later, I was called back down to do a physical lineup. 7 men in the lineup. 7 men, and the only thing between me and them was a table. No windows, no mirrors, no doors, nothing. But I saw him. I knew it was him. I mean, he was trying to throw me off because he was wearing brown and not blue, and his hair was more of an afro, and I remembered it a little bit shorter, but you know, they can do that. I mean, 10 days is a long time to grow your hair. It was number 5. I wrote it on a piece of paper, and they said, good job. That's who you picked out in the lineup. And again, the relief was huge. It was massive. The second victim had not been able to make an ID. I had to do this for her, for me, for every woman. And now we would go to trial, State versus Cotton, 1985. 2 weeks of my life sitting there listening to lie after lie after lie, testifying for 2 days as my character was assaulted. Unfortunately, the jury came back with the only logical thing, and that is Ronald Cotton was guilty of all charges, and he would receive life in 54 years. And it was the first time I could breathe. I was safe. And then they pat you on the head and they tell you, now you can move on, Jennifer, and put your life back together again, right? Not so much. I didn't have anything to put together again. Everything that I had worked for was over. Everything. I graduated in 85. I got a job in a bank. And in 1987, the appellate court of North Carolina overturned the decision. See, they thought it was really important. The jury should have known there had been this second victim who couldn't make an ID. And if maybe her ID was not valid, and maybe her memory wasn't good, maybe my memory was bad, and maybe I'd made a mistake. Ronald had been confessing that he was all innocent, right? That somebody else had done this crime. Somebody by the name of Bobby Poole had been running around the prison system bragging that he committed these rapes that Ronald Cotton was serving time for. But these are felons. That's why they're in prison. Nobody's going to believe them because they lie. I remember who raped me. I couldn't not remember. I wanted to forget it. I wanted to wipe it out of my memory bank, but I couldn't. So in 1987, under voir dire, they brought this new person, Bobby Poole, in front of me. And the judge said, Mr. Poole, did you confess to raping these women? No, man, I never said nothing like that. Ms. Thompson, do you see the man in the courtroom today that raped you? I said, yes, Your Honor, it's Ronald Cotton. I've never seen this man before in my life. And Ronald Cotton would receive 2 life sentences and 2 terms of 15 years each for all charges against me and the second victim. Ronald Cotton would be spending the rest of his life in prison. He would die in prison. And that was the way it should be. I got married in 1988, and I got pregnant in 1989. I gave birth to the triplets in the spring of 1990. Every night I would put these little babies to bed, and I would watch their little tummies go up and down as they're breathing and thinking, man, the world is the most perfect place. And I would pray. I'd pray for God to watch over my children and, hey, while you're at it, do me this favor and have Ronald die. Have him die tonight in prison. It's okay to pray those things. Good people can do that to bad people. And I would pray that prayer for the next 5 years until I was visited by Mike Galden, the original investigator from our case. And he came to me and he said, Jennifer, have you ever heard of DNA? I said, yeah, I know what DNA is. Well, Ronald still says he's innocent. We know he's not. But if the state of North Carolina allows this DNA test to go through, your blood sample's disintegrated. You'll have to submit to a new blood sample. I said, well, you know what? Let's go to the lab right now. I'll give you that blood. You run that test. Because I can't do this again. I gave him the blood. They ran the test. I didn't think about it. I didn't stay awake through March and April and May thinking about what the test results were going to show. I knew what it was going to show. I had seen this space in my mind for 11 years. And when they came back to my house in June of 1995, they stood in my kitchen and they said, Jennifer, that DNA doesn't belong to Ronald Cotton. It's Bobby Poole's. Okay, well, what do you say, right? I mean, what do you do? I ask people what I should do, right? Should I call him? Should I write him? I mean, what do I do? What do I say? People said, no, don't do anything, because he was a bad person anyway. He probably did a crime he never got caught for. I mean, they feed these people in prison 3 times a day. You know, they get a bed, they can play basketball, they can get a degree. It's not so bad. He'd be dead anyway. The way he was living his life, you should feel okay about all this. I thought, yeah, that works for me. For about a second, till you realize that's just complete illogic. So I did nothing about it for the next 2 years. April of 1997, I sat in a church, not but about 1.5 miles from where I'd been raped 13 years before, and I waited for this man, Ronald Cotton. I didn't know what I was going to say to him. I couldn't even figure out what I was going to call him. And before I could come up with any words, this massive 6'4" man, taking up the whole doorway, looks at me, and I started to cry. And I said, Ronald, if I spend every minute of every day for the rest of my life telling you I'm sorry, could you ever forgive me? And Ronald started to cry, and he looked at me and took my hands, and he said, Jennifer, I forgave you years ago. I'm not angry at you. We were both victims of the system. We were both victims of Bobby Poole. I want you to feel happy. I want to be happy. I want you to have a good life. I want to have a good life. Don't be afraid of me, because I'll never hurt you. And for the first time in 13 years, I started to heal. For the first time in 13 years, I could let go of the rage and the anger and the hate, and that the man I had prayed to die would be the man to teach me to live again. They killed Gary Graham in June of 2000. They executed him. And I vowed that day that for the rest of my life, I would work to abolish the death penalty. And since that time, for the last 15 years, Ronald and I have flown back and forth all across the country, into Europe, into Mexico, telling our story about what happens when the system fails and who do we look like. So it's my pleasure now to ask Ronald to come up and tell you his story.
It's a pleasure and honor to be here today. My name is Ronald Cotton. I'm from Memoir, North Carolina. I'm going to take you back in time. When 1984, I'll never forget the day that I stood up in court. I was found guilty by a jury foreman of all the charges that were placed upon me for a crime I never committed: first-degree rape, first-degree sexual offense, and first-degree burglary. I could never forget those words. I heard the ringing in my head with my 2 attorneys standing beside me with their head down. And the district attorney called out the charges once again. And Your Honor, he said, Mr. Cotton, he said, do you have anything to tell the court today about why you have been convicted on these charges? I said, Your Honor, the only thing I have to say to the court is that I'd like to have your permission to sing this song. I'm going to try to sing this song right now. If you don't like it, just put your hand over your ears and cover it up. I've been a little bit up under the weather. As y'all probably heard me coughing and getting choked a little bit. But it goes a little something like this. It was a poem I wrote to my girlfriend while I was incarcerated in the county jail. But I conversed the words and changed it into a gospel song. It was like this. Decisions I can no longer make because my future's so unknown to me, and that I could no longer take. 'Cause during the day I wonder, at night I heard with fear, call out his name so much, and suddenly tears appear. Until God came in my life, until God came in my life, I was often alone. And people I really couldn't face, I just didn't know what to do. If I felt so out of place, how many times must I say this before you agree? There's no other God who ever loved of you, not quite as much as Lord God. Believe me, everyone, 'cause God will change your life, and that is a fact. 'Cause I would pray both night and day until God came into my life. Thank you. But after I sung that song, the judge looked at me. I looked at my attorneys. They dropped their head down like they was in shame. Handed me a prison term of life and 54 years. I went back to the county jail, packed my bags. I wrote a letter to the head jailer and tell him that I was ready to go on in prison and start serving my time. 2 days went by. They finally come and got me. Said, Mr. Cotton, pack your bags. You're heading to prison. I told them my bags are already packed. I've been ready to go. So they put me on a little cruiser. Took me down the Interstate 85 up here from Graham, North Carolina. Handcuffed, shackled. I had my hair plaited up from growing an afro in prison, the county jail there. I had my serving fork. I had to use that little pick to pick my little hair loose. But in that station wagon heading down to Central Prison in Raleigh, I thought about my girlfriend, all the things, the people that meant so much to me that I was leaving behind. I started tearing up. They said, grown men doesn't cry, but that's a lie. I got a heart. I got feelings. I shed a few tears because I was leaving someone behind that meant so much to me. But once I got in that prison, I just couldn't believe, the things guys hollering, fresh meat, this and that. But I let it go in one ear and out the other. I went to my cell. It was like a little dorm with about 12 people in it. I made my bunk. I laid down, got to thinking about my situation. All this time I'm a very young man, 22, going into prison with life in 54 years for something another man had committed. But I went through the process. I entered that prison. I took a job in the kitchen. Guys kept telling me, Cotton, you shouldn't have took this job because they talking about raping you. I said, well, look, you tell them the head long, the feet long, bring it on. So, guys, they made an approach. I had to be a man and take a stand. I wasn't about to bow down. I walked in prison as a man. I told them I'm going to leave a man. So, I got in fights and things. But so one day, I was heading to the gym to work out. I passed this officer escorting an inmate inside. I looked at him. I said, I've seen this guy before. So immediately, I returned to my dormitory, and I had cut an article about the rape charges against me out the newspaper. I had a drawing of the suspect. And so once I retrieved that from my locker, I approached this guy. I said, because that's him. I was outside playing handball and noticed this guy standing observing the game. I had someone to come and relieve me from the game, and I made approach on him. I said, "Excuse me." I said, "But where are you from?" He said, "I'm from Burlington." I said, I am also. I said, "You kind of resemble the drawing of the composite sketch of a crime I'm in prison for that you committed the crime." And he immediately said no. So I pursued my situation. I went head on and just worked out. The next day, I had a guy that approached me sexually in the shower. I told him I don't play that game. I said, "My door doesn't swing that way." So I went to him again because I didn't want to fight this guy because I was in the nude taking a shower. I didn't want to fight no guy in the nude, slip and fall and, get my head, stuff like that. So the next day I approached him, tried to talk to him like a man. He pushed me. When he put his hand on me, it made me go off on him. I ended up breaking this guy's jaw. He go to segregation. 30 days later, he come out, and he saw me in my dorm writing a letter. And he walked up to the window. He hollered in. He said, "Hey, Cotton, can I speak to you?" I said, "Sure, come on in." And once inside, he sat down at a chair beside my bunk. He apologized for fighting me. He said, "Man, you're a fighting dude." He said, "I just wanted to become your friend." I said, "Well, you don't become my friend approaching me like that." So he immediately told me that his friend had confessed to him that he had me serving time for a crime that he committed. So later that night, I wrote a letter to my lawyers in Burlington and Graham, and I had to wait and wait. And then this guy that committed the crime I was in for, he approached me 2 days later. He said, "Look, Cotton, I know you got a lot of sisters," which I do. I have 8 sisters. I have 4 brothers, and they from the area locally. And I said, "Well, I know you want to write my sister." I said, "But which one you talking about writing?" He said, "I want to write your sister named Tootie." I said, "Well, look, guy, I don't normally let guys in prison write my sisters." I said, "But with you," I said, "I'm going to think about it." I said, "But better yet, let's take a picture." And I send it to her. I write a letter. If she like what she sees, she'll write you back. If she don't, I don't know what to tell you. So I took this picture of him and I together, and I sat down that night and I wrote a letter to my lawyer, and I sent that picture to my lawyer instead of my sister. So a couple weeks went by. He made an approach on me. He said, "Well, did your sister write you back?" I said, "Man, she ain't wrote me back yet. Evidently, she didn't like what she saw, so I don't know what to tell you." So my lawyer, they began to work on my case and got me back in court. In 1987, I was sitting on a bunk in prison, writing a letter to a pen pal of mine from New York that her son had given me her name and address, Wayne County Jail. I wrote this letter to her, and all of a sudden a vision came over me of a female with long hair and no facial features, so I assumed that it was Jennifer. And I prayed to the good Lord to remove this hate and hatred in my heart that I had feelings toward her at the time. And once I said that prayer, a few days later, all that hatred had relieved from my body, mind, and soul. I could go ahead and do my time at ease. But this guy, Mr. Poole, that committed this crime, I very so much wanted to kill this guy. I was going to school in prison, and I stayed after school one day, and I pulled a piece of metal out the teacher's desk, and I sharpened it down on the basketball court. I took a T-shirt, wrapped it around the handle, and took some hot glue, made a handle for this weapon. And I told Mr. Poole, and once I get a chance, that I'm taking him out, and it wasn't out to eat. So my father, he paid me a visit, and I told my father what my thinking was about and what I planned on doing to Mr. Poole. My father, he said, "Ron," he said, "Look, you told me that you're innocent. I believe you're innocent, but if you kill this guy," he said, "you're going to be guilty." So I thought about it for days. And late one night, around about 2 o'clock in the morning, I got out of my bunk. I took this weapon. I walked over to the restroom across the hall, noticed a drain pipe open in the floor, and I took that weapon, dropped it in it. I listened to it rattle till it hit the bottom. I could have easily taken that weapon and sold it for $30, $40 and ate many moon pies, bags of tater chips, and drank many sodas, cigarettes. but it wasn't worth it, you know. I'm an innocent man trying to get out of prison, not trying to stay in prison. And so once they transferred me to Mason, Tennessee, from Raleigh-Durham International Airport, handcuffed, shackled, landed on an Air Force base up in Mason, Tennessee. I went to work in a closed house. I would often walk the yard, prison yard, with weights, jogging, and, you know, with a lot on my mind. I often wrote letters into the court, trying to get the situation overturned in my case, but I often turned my appeals down. So I still couldn't give up. I wrote many letters, near and far, that was often denied because of the distance. But I said, this is like sending me to war. I'm going to fight fire with fire. So one day, I was watching the OJ trial, and I took my little legal pad, started taking notes, get my radio, put my headphones in, going out on the yard, sitting by myself, continue to take notes. And once I felt I had enough information that I need about my case, I wrote a letter to the Court of Appeals in Raleigh. Days went by, months. They wrote me back and said, Mr. Cotton, we're going to do a DNA in your case as you requested. Said, but if the results come back stating that you're guilty, you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. What do you want us to do? I immediately wrote them back and said, look, I have nothing to lose. I'm an innocent man. I know it. The good Lord up above knows it. I said, put your foot down and go with it. I said, if the tests come back stating anything other than innocent, I said, someone tampered with that test. Days went by, months. The warden sent for me from my cell one night. I was escorted to his office. I went inside. He said, Mr. Cotton, he said, you're going home in the morning. He said, your test results come back from your DNA testing and said that you're an innocent man. He said, but what I want you to do for me is tell me the prison guards that are bringing drugs into this prison. I said, well, look, I'm not going to be your snitch. He said, but you're going home. I said, but that don't mean nothing. He said, you're not coming back to prison. I said, you don't know what the future holds for me. So he gets mad. He sent me back to my dorm. I got so excited, I began to ish out things that I had. So the very next morning, I was called to get my belongings and go home. He said I had everything that I had other than toothpaste. I took home with me 6 months of toothpaste that I accumulated from prison, you know, because that's what I did. I was a swap shop guy. But once in that vehicle, heading down the highway with handcuffs on, the officer looked over to me in the back seat. He said, look, have you eaten at McDonald's lately? I said, come on, man, I've been locked up 11 years. I'm eating at McDonald's. He said, well, we're going to take you to McDonald's. I said, okay. So they pulled into McDonald's, rode around, drive by, and pulled up to the menu. I said, what would you like, Mr. Cotton? I said, well, I was number 5 in the lineup. How about a number 5? That sounds good. So they get my meal, drove around and parked the car, takes me out and sit me at the table, even though I had handcuffs on still. I sat down and ate my meal, back in the cruiser down the interstate. We go to Asheboro Prison Unit. I stayed there overnight. I slept like a fireman without my shoes on. Didn't even make my bunk. I was so excited. I was glad to be on my way home. And once in Alamance County, Graham, North Carolina, I gets out the car and walks in the courtroom. I done cut my afro down to a TWA. Ain't talking about an airplane either. So and once inside, it felt like I was in a dream. So I took my hand and pinched myself. I felt the pain. I said, no, it's real here. And so I gets inside. I go to my attorney table. I looks over at the DA table, and he stands up and calls out the charges. The judge looks at me, informed me to stand up, and I did. And he said, Mr. Cotton, the charges against you have now been dismissed. You free man. You can go home. And my family just bomb rushed me, hugged me, crying. And I said, well, I've been locked up for 11 years. I said, I don't have a home to go to. But my sister, too, she said, Ron, you can come and stay with me until you get up on your feet. So I stayed with her for like 8 months. I worked at LabCorp in Elon, the company that did my DNA testing. They gave me a job. I worked for them for 3 years. I wasn't making the money that I needed so quickly, so I went to work at Golden Corral making yeast rolls, some of the yeast rolls that some of y'all may have eaten back in the day. But I finally get this opportunity to meet Miss Thompson at the church, and it was the most wonderful feeling that I felt in years. I walked in the church. She's sitting there with a little jean outfit on, a little skirt, and looking at me with fear expression on her face. And so she said what she said, I don't know what to call you. And she called my name, called my last name, my middle name, my full name. I said, I'm all those. So I reached and grabbed her hand. I said, look, you don't have to look over your shoulder thinking I'm going to be there to harm you, because I will not. I said, I want peace and happiness just like I want you to have peace and happiness. I said, if you look over your shoulder thinking I'm going to be there to harm you, I said, I promise you it will not be me. So we resumed our friendship. We exchanged phone numbers, and we began to go out doing what we're doing today. We wrote a book titled Picking Cotton. If you haven't read it, go to your nearest bookstore and pick one up. Don't try to borrow your friends. And I tell you, it's a really great story. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
So we have like 10 minutes left, so all three of our panelists are here for questions. If anybody has questions, are you guys okay with taking questions now?
Come on, man. I know you got some questions. Don't be ashamed.
Right there. So I have a question. I read the book and loved the story and was really struck, especially by the reaction of the community and by your family of your rape. I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on if you think we've changed at all in the past, 20 plus years, and how we treat rape victims, or if we've improved at all, or if we still have room for improvement.
No. I don't think we've changed how we deal with rape victims at all. And I think that there's just vast room for improvement, to be honest with you. I mean, still when I tell the story, it's interesting how people deal with my story versus like a campus assault story. It's just this, we have an interesting definition of rape and sexual violence and recovery and what victims experience and how we're supposed to deal with them. I don't think we're anywhere close to where we need to be. I really don't. And that's a sad thing. I've told the story thousands of times, and after every story I tell, there is at least 2 or 3 young women that come up to me and cry, and they tell me their stories and tell me about how they were dealt with, either by the community or the university or their families, and it's really a shame. It's just awful. Yes.
So we've heard a lot about the dangers of misidentification, and especially cross-racial misidentification. What are some reforms that you think would be helpful in the court system to deal with these issues, and what would you like to see happen?
As it relates to Eyewitness? Well, we've actually made some incredible strides in North Carolina. North Carolina, I'm sure you guys know this, North Carolina was the first state to mandate best practices in every police department across our state. Did you guys know that? Do you know what best practices are? Raise your hand if you do. Oh, good. Okay. So, BJ. Best practices is a standard that has been set, and what that means is Neil kind of alluded to blind administration. So one of the things we really recommend is when we're doing a photo lineup and a physical lineup, that the lineup should be shown sequentially as opposed to simultaneously. So that's the first reform. And the way that it was administered to me was simultaneous. 6 pictures, 8 pictures, 10 pictures, whatever the protocol is in the department. And how many people here have taken an SAT test? I mean, this is like a trick question because you all did, because you wouldn't be here. And so when you took that SAT test, all of you did what's called relative judgment, right? You have a question, there's 5 answers, you can eliminate 3 of them, you narrow it down to 2, you pick the one you think most closely would be the answer. And what we do when we are administered photo or physical lineups simultaneously is we inadvertently, subconsciously commit relative judgment. And that's what happened to me. I could very quickly that day, and I remember the day very clearly, I could eliminate 4 of the photographs. And it's all subconscious, so you actually don't know you're doing this. You narrow it down and you think, well, those ears look closer to the ears that I remember, or that nose more closely matches the nose that I remember. And so you come up with the one. And so when we administer the test sequentially, what we do instead is we show one photograph at a time. And the victim, the witness, is shown one photograph. They have to make a determination based on that one photograph. That photograph is now put down. The next photograph is picked up. You have to make a determination on that photograph, one at a time. And that eliminates the relative judgment because you can't do comparisons. And the other big reform that we've done is the double-blind or blind administrators. So whoever's administering the test cannot know who the suspect is. Therefore, they can't give you verbal, nonverbal attends. We've had a lot of our cases where the victim or witness kind of stares at number 3 for a while, and the officer says, "I've noticed you stared at number 3." Of course, number 3 is their suspect. "I've noticed you stared at number 3. Is there something about number 3 that you really, And so what that does to the victim or witness is, oh, that must be the suspect because they're giving me some type of affirmation or feedback. So that eliminates that. And the other thing North Carolina has done is audio videotaping of the administration of these tests. And that shows us, A, that the test was administered properly. It also gives us a level of certainty at the time of the actual test, as opposed to 6 months later. That kind of, the story I told you about Gary Graham, when a person looks at a lineup, and they say something like, I'm 75% sure that's the person I remember. By the time they get to trial, they're 100% certain. So what the audio videotaping does is it allows us to see how certain that victim or witness was at the time of the test. And in North Carolina, you can't, and Jamie would probably correct me since he's an actual lawyer and I'm not, but you can't bring a case to trial if it's an ID case unless these protocols have now been used, if I understand that correctly.
No,
they find loopholes to get through it now?
Various reasons to forgive the procedure used, but it's sort of a strike when they're introducing identification but oftentimes they find reason to find the in-court identification reliable despite the fact that this administration procedure was not.
Even now?
Yeah.
Well, then, see, there you go. That's how far we've come.
Confirming those cases on that basis.
Okay.
It's improved significantly.
Okay. Well, then that's good news. So those would be the reforms that we're working on. I'll actually be in California next month working on some legislation there to help California pass some best practices. And so far to date, I think there's only a handful of states as a whole that have passed. New Jersey, North Carolina, New Mexico, Ohio, Connecticut, New Hampshire. That might be it. As a state. Different departments pass it, but not on state as a whole. Does that answer your question?
I was just wondering if you thought that you would have ever kind of opened yourself up to Mr. Cotton's innocence without the DNA. And if not, for those of us that are working with the Innocence Project and maybe have eyewitness identifications in our cases but don't have DNA evidence, what is the starting point for even working with victims, and is there even really a starting point that you can get to?
That's a really good question. I mean, the short answer to your first part is no, I never would have, ever. Because that's just the way the memory works. I mean, by the time I had made the identification and the photo lineup and given the feedback of good job, that's who we thought it was, to the physical lineup, good job, that's who you picked out in the lineup, in the photo. By that point, now everything in my memory bank had been wiped out as to Bobby Poole, and Ronald Cotton's face had been cemented in my memory forever. And so much so that, like I said, in the second trial, when I see Bobby Poole, there is no memory at all. And I still don't have a memory of Bobby Poole. I just don't. And that's the way we contaminate people's memories. And once we contaminate a person's memory, it's kind of like, I try to equate this with a pureed soup as opposed to a chunky soup. You know, once you puree that, there's no way to pull out the individual pieces. And that's the way your memory works. Once you contaminate a person's mind, you can't uncontaminate it. Like, you just can't pull apart false and true. How do you deal with it would have to, I really don't know, because I've worked with some victims in cases where there's no DNA. As a matter of fact, I just worked with one just recently, and it was a false confession, and there is no DNA. And it's the sister of the deceased, and she's like, he confessed. How can this possibly be true? How are they walking out after 29 years? How has this happened? And to try to get her to understand that, these cases actually happen, that how false confessions work, how our memories work, is almost impossible. It's just really, really difficult. So I don't know how you, I don't know how you deal with that, with the exception of just trying to lay out the evidence that you have and hope that they're open-minded enough to entertain the possibility of innocence. I think we've gotten better, because when Ronald came out of prison, he was the first person in North Carolina to be exonerated. He was the 23rd in the country. Like, we weren't talking about innocent people in prison. So I didn't know that this happened. I mean, now we've got 1,400. So I think we're more open to the prospect that we do have innocent people in prison under many different reasons. So, as you know, and as most of you know, the vast majority won't have DNA in their cases. It's just a rare, like 20% of felonies have DNA available to begin with. And honestly, in our case, the DNA that had survived was subpoenaed to be incinerated. And they stopped it 3 days before it was to be destroyed. So had the DNA gone through and been incinerated when it was supposed to be, Ronald Cotton wouldn't be standing here. And I wouldn't be standing here either. So, and I would never have ever come around to the fact that we had made a mistake. Never. Mm-hmm.
Had a fair chance you and your lawyers had a fair chance to present your case, or if the whole thing just felt like a sham.
Well, due to process of law, my lawyer instructed me to not take the stand, which I probably should have, to probably put up a better defense on my side, but I may have come out, with the same result as I did the first time, but it was a total loss from the get-go, so, I had to keep on fighting. I would have lost anyway. Thank you.
So we're out of time, but let's give a hand to our speakers.
Did you get his?
His address? I don't know how you guys are split. The check that I sent. So I figured that I would send it to me to figure that out. If that works.
Okay.